Yeah, I will, kia ora tātou. So this is about bursting bubbles. So the bubbles that I want to burst tonight are that good relationships at the political and administrative interface and political nous are not things that just happen by osmosis or through some strange alchemy, but they can be codified and built. And I want to say that tonight this is my last gig for NZOG as Executive Director for Aotearoa, so I'm going to take a little bit of a break and then I'm coming back as a practice fellow, whatever that means. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about being called a fellow, actually. See what happens. So, and I think there are people, maybe some of my colleagues online as well. So tonight I want to demystify the relationships between ministers and officials and say that they can be codified and built, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework for that. I want to demystify what political nous means in practice, and I think that could be codified and built as well. And then I want to put this in a context of what is good policy, so that can apply to any environment. So you don't have to be a policy person to be thinking about how you give advice. And in fact, I think the word policy often gets in the way. I think if we think about it more as support for good decision making, then that's a much more apt way of describing what policy advisors do, but not only just if you're advising a minister, but if you're advising a senior leader or a board or anything. Any kind of group. So I want this to be a conversation, not a lecture. So I know there are people online, so please get your questions into the chat. And I've commandeered my poor partner to be looking at those chat questions and asking them on your behalf. And I'll be sharing some insights from, so it's not just my view, but from some conversations that I've been running recently with between NZOG and IPANS, where we've had people from across the political administrative interface, so politicians, chief executives and chiefs of staff talking about some of these issues. I'm going to share what they've been talking about as well. And we'll give you the resources, we'll give you the slides at the end, and I've got a whole lot of resources in there, lots of publications and things that you can look at afterwards. So I came to this whole area really from looking at how do we build good advice and how do we build the capability that underpins that advice. So as Bill said, I set up the policy project in New Zealand, but I've also been working with lots of other jurisdictions, the UK, Ireland through the OECD recently, and departments in Australia. And I like to think of this as, I think when people look at how do we create good advice for decision makers, they often think just about that supply side. And usually the automatic response is, let's just train people up, let's just give them some policy training. Whereas what I've been trying to argue is that it's actually more of an infrastructure. We need to think about all the policies, all the processes, systems and tools that underpin good advice. And I call this the policy infrastructure. And even when people are looking at more of a systemic approach, they still focus on that supply side. And I'm really interested to think about how do we focus more on this demand side. You know, how do we work with decision makers? How do we understand what their role is in policy, and how do we help shape that authorising environment for good policy? So if anyone's interested in policy capability in general, there's some papers at the end that I've spent time writing, so we'll share those with you. And actually one of the really interesting things about working at NZOG, so I started working on some of the demand side components when I worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, but of course it's really hard to work on those sorts of things from inside government. So it's much nicer now at NZOG where I can work on government without actually working in it. So we're in a great space where we can start talking about these issues. So I said I wanted to break down the dimensions of the relationships between ministers and officials and put these into some key components. And I call this the policy prenup. And it's, you know, because I think relationships between ministers and officials is a bit like a marriage, but one that you're not in for life, which is good in some ways. So I just want to talk about some of these key components. So I think the first thing is about how do you set a strategic program, and that requires some conversations with ministers seeking clarity on their priorities, and also negotiating some space for these longer term policy stewardship issues. And I know that's something that Wendy and the Institute are really interested in. So these emerging and future issues. And I think, we have long-term insights briefings now, but it's not just a one-off, but something that goes on and on. How do we think about leaving some space in our programs for these long-term future issues, things that are going to bite us in the future if we don't start dealing with them now. We also need to think about the sort of ground rules for commissioning advice and making sure that those discussions aren't lost in translation. And we've seen over and over again, I know there are people in the room who will have seen that you need to ensure that the requests from ministers are actually recorded and understood, and you know what the minister's asking for. So, and sometimes they can be lost in translation between a minister's office and a department. So by the time it gets to the poor analyst who's starting to provide that advice, it might be something completely different that they think they're being asked to do. I also think that we need to think about the operating model. So how do we discuss with ministers and agree how you engage with them and their office and their advisors, and set these expectations of free and frank advice. So invite it and expect it, and learn about, as officials, we need to learn about those presentational preferences. So how does a minister or a decision maker like to receive advice? Sometimes they're more verbal, so they want to receive it verbally. Sometimes they're readers, so they like to have a whole paper. Some people like a quick A3, so they can see it at a glance. And I haven't seen anyone wanting anything like interpretive dance, but who knows, we might get that in the next government. But it's really important to think about the decision maker and how they like to receive advice. And then the last one really is, how do you ensure that decision makers are intelligent customers of advice too? How do you ensure that they know that what you're giving them is really good advice? And actually, in one of the papers there, that the article that is linked in the slide, I've given a little sort of a cheat sheet for a decision maker too, so that how they can interrogate advice that's delivered to them. So these are the four components, I think, of the demand side that we really need to think about. And it's a great time to be thinking about these now as people are preparing for potentially a prenup with a new minister or a refresh of that relationship with the same minister as we move into an election. So as I said, I've had a number of conversations recently, curated conversations I call them, but with politicians and officials and people in the middle, to talk about what are good relationships between ministers and officials, and how might you build those things, and what each side needs to do to make that relationship work. So this is what they said, and I'm going to paraphrase them. I've taken a little bit of license, I think. So what they said, what can ministers do? And I'm hoping there might be some politicians who'll see this, or we can translate it to them. But what can ministers do, or decision makers do, to ensure good relationships with the people that are advising them? They really need to be clear about what they want to achieve. So don't think you have to have all the answers, but have really, really good questions. Get your office in order. So this lost in translation piece, mitigate that. Set expectations about who's in your office, and how they can be a bridge, not a barrier, so that how they can build those relationships with the department as well. So as I said, ask good questions and be able to interrogate the advice, and then invite really scary ideas. So, I think really confident ministers expect free and frank advice, and they want new ideas. It's the ones that I think are less confident, who just think of their advisors as the delivery wing of what they do. And as I said before, allowing some space in work programs for this longer term thinking and stewardship responsibilities. And I think there's a bit of a myth that politicians aren't interested in anything that goes beyond the 3-year election cycle, because it's not going to be theirs. But I think if we talk to them about that, could be their legacy. People will remember if you have some really great ideas and can implement them. And then on the other side, what can officials do to build good relationships with ministers? So free, frank and fearless advice, totally. But once a decision has been taken, then you really have to implement it enthusiastically, and try and bring as many perspectives into your advice as possible. one of the things that someone said at one of the sessions we ran was, don't try and be a ministerial whisperer. So don't second guess what the minister wants either. And I think there's far too much of that goes on that, well, the minister won't accept that. Well, sometimes you just got to have a go. Maybe they will, depends on the day. And build trust by showing that you understand the overall government program and the minister's interests. And I think this whole notion of being bold too. So don't wait to be asked for advice. Be proactive and articulate these current or emerging or future challenges. So that's really part of this notion of stewardship, policy stewardship. So think ahead. And then exercise political nous. So everyone talked about that. Being politically neutral or non-partisan doesn't mean being apolitical. And I think this is a Wayne Eggleston quote, actually. Understand the politics without getting involved in the politics. So you can still be really, really interested in politics without being partisan or getting stuck into party politics. So in terms of political nous, I think that political nous is something, and I'll talk a little bit about the policy skills framework later, but it's one of those things that we talk about a lot. Like, it's a bit like strategic thinking, that we talk about it and say everyone needs to have it, but we don't actually articulate what that looks like. So from these discussions that I had with across with the series with IPANs, we looked at what does political nous look like in practice. So I'm just going to go through these now. So hone your political antennae, understand the complexity and those unwritten signals that you can pick up, and understand who has power and influence in the political ecosystem. And at the moment, it's really, really important too to understand the Crown Māori relationships in any area. So know who the right people are, who's saying what, and hit the target at the right time in the right place. So sometimes you've got to keep your powder dry, I suppose, and come out with advice at the right time. And sometimes there are no-go zones, so it's not worth flogging dead horses. But sometimes it might be you'll have an idea and you can just bring it out when it feels like it's the right time. I think the other thing is that we need to understand that the public service is not the only provider of advice to ministers. So they have tons of other sources: their party, their parliamentary colleagues, even personal things. So you've got to really seek and articulate that alignment. But that doesn't mean that you can't challenge it as well. It just means being aware of all of those different, those diverse advice that and the pressures on them. And then that's really part of shaping that authorising environment. So building trust and curating that relationship capital that you can invest in and then draw on later. But also you really need to understand the rules. So understand the obligations and the guardrails and the guidance. So the Cabinet Manual, the Public Service Code of Conduct, and there's really good advice out from the Public Service Commission at the moment on how to behave during an election, which everybody should be looking at. I know that it's been all over social media, but it's really good to think about those things and have courageous conversations. So be bold, be courageous. And then if we look at what is political nous missing in action, and I think often in government, it's a bit like housework, you notice it more when it's not done. And I think that's the case with political nous. You really notice it when it's missing in action. So I'm thinking about these people, like I call it the show off, so individuals who just want to hear their own voice and get the minister's attention because they think that's going to build their career, which it doesn't necessarily. Or being a strident advocate, so lobbying, you've got an idea and you want to push it regardless of what the evidence is and what's going to work. The rogue, so not following the due process. And I think that sometimes you can be a bit quick and dirty with advice, but it will usually come back to bite you if you don't follow the process. The blabbermouth, failing to protect the minister, so like talking about things when you shouldn't be, even though I think New Zealand is probably the most transparent in the world, really, like in the sense that we have proactively released cabinet papers and things like that. But sharing the wrong information with the wrong person at the wrong time just won't help you. And this one really bothers me, the sycophant, being too quick to curry favour with the minister. So it's that sort of, yes, minister, how high should I jump, minister? And I think ministers realise that too, and they will notice it and they don't like it either. well, I talked about the policy skills framework, and when I set up the policy project, one of I thought, let's get back to basics. What does a good policy organisation look like? What does good policy advice look like? And what does a good policy advisor look like? And that meant, and this was all co-created with the policy community, but really articulating what were the skills that people needed. So these are descriptions from the policy skills framework. But the two that are really relevant for tonight are political nous. Actually, I think it's called political savvy in the skills framework, and understanding the political context and priorities. So this is the political nous description that we've got here. And so really it's the kind of things that I've been talking about, having the ear and trust of the decision maker, have courageous conversations while maintaining these good relationships. And what we did in the skills framework too was to think about these as developing levels of expertise. So for people starting out, for the people as a safe pair of hands, so people are practicing and know what they're doing, and then these people are really top of their game. So it's a way of people looking at these different descriptions and thinking about where they are and where they want to be. A note that I've referred here to the Te Arawhiti Māori Crown relations as core competency. So the Te Arawhiti frameworks are really important in this space, I think, where they have, there's 3 frameworks, but in terms of engagement with Māori and having cultural competency, this is really important part of political nous, and more, I think. And I think understanding that you're not going to be an expert right away, but some people are naturally more attuned to relationships with ministers because they have good interpersonal skills or they have good empathy, but these are things that you can develop and build. So again, understanding what the political context and priorities are and how you might think about knowing what those are. So having an awareness of government priorities, your own department's priorities, the sector, the public service, and that wider ecosystem that you're working in, and how you can articulate how your work impacts or is impacted by those priorities. So it really means keeping your ears and eyes open to the policy and political ecosystem. So one of the things we thought about too was like how might you build your muscle in these skills. So we've articulated these skills from starting out to top of your game, but how would you develop those sorts of things too? And thinking about these just in terms of how you develop skills generally, which is the old 70, 20, 10 ratio for development, and again moving up expert practicing or developing. And so so this one is for political nous. How might you build some political nous policy muscle? And I'll start at the developing one this time because somebody who's wanting to develop their skills might read the manifestos, ministerial speeches, press releases. Actually, somebody suggested a really good thing was to watch a politician's maiden speech in Parliament, because that says a lot about who they are and what they want to achieve in their career. Understand the strategic priorities of a department, senior leadership processes, and really know the cabinet guide so that you understand what you're required to do. In terms of learning from others, and I'll stick with the developing one again, is this shadowing more experienced colleagues to meetings and discussing the insights afterwards. And it's interesting, Bill, I remember, I think the Treasury is probably the best at this, at taking young people to meetings, so that you get to see political nous in practice, you get to see how more senior people operate. And I think it depends, obviously it depends on the minister and the senior leadership of a department, but it's such a great training ground for people. And as somebody who's worked in a minister's office myself, you can see how people learn by seeing and learn by doing. But if you can't do that, at least finding opportunities that when senior leaders come back to the department, asking them how it went. What did the minister say? What did you say? What worked? What didn't work? So that we're providing these opportunities for learning all the time.
And you'll find that ministers like to hear the voice, the analyst reporting.
Yes, they do. Well, some ministers do, yeah. It's really interesting because some ministers like to hear only from the senior people, and others want to want to hear from the analyst who actually wrote the report and knows the detail. And of course, I would say that was a good minister actually, who wants to hear the detail regardless of the seniority of the person who they're talking to. I think there's very little formal training in this space, so that's why I think it's important to actually find some ways of codifying these things. So I think it's also about what an individual can do to take responsibility for their own development, but also what more senior people can do to take responsibility for other younger people's development. What can we do as you know, at a team or organisational level to help people build their skills, not only in this space, but in general policy space. So I want everyone to think about what you can do for others. And the bottom line is this is all about how do we create better decisions, how do we create better advice, for better government decision making that's going to be better for the people that we're supposed to be, the public services here to serve.
Well, I'd just like to thank Sally for her presentation. I think there's so much insight and knowledge in there that we need to work out how to distribute that widely. Certainly, there's lots of policy advisors, particularly in Wellington, that would find it useful because it's a very difficult environment in which to work. There's a lot of pressure, particularly working within coalition governments in terms of the tension between different policy priorities. So I think it's a really useful guide in terms of how to manage those, but also I like the development framework and how you can actually build your knowledge and expertise, but also where you have it, how you then impart it. So you build that capability. So I think there's some great insights. But also congratulations on your new fellowship. I'm sure we'll get that.
I don't even know what it means yet. So
so it's well good. But thank you on behalf of Wendy and the Institute for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you to Wendy for her public service and the Institute for your public service. Thank you to everyone for coming, ngā mihi nui, and ka kite anō.